Dr. Nabil Babai holds a PhD in second language education and teaches EAP research and composition and humanities at Yorkfield University. Dr. Babai investigates EAL students' academic literacy development and teaching and learning in multilingual post-secondary contexts. NAPME has offered numerous invited and peer-reviewed talks at national and international conferences and has published her work in book chapters and journals. Dr. Babai understands international students' potential academic and emotional challenges when they pursue their studies in another country and is highly passionate about supporting them. So with that, please join me in welcome Dr.
Much, and thank you everyone for being here. I hope you have enjoyed the conference so far. And it's really my pleasure to present my research at this conference. My research touches on teaching multilingual, multicultural classes, and I can imagine many of you can relate to this context because we all have international students in our classes. So I begin this research with providing context around the topic, especially higher education in Canada. And then I will, this study is actually my reflection on how I teach multilingual, multicultural classes. I share the study with you and then definitely will open the floor to discussion question. If you have any questions or comments, if you would like to share your experiences, definitely we'll do that at the end of the presentation. So as we all know, the estimated number of international migrants has increased during the past 10 years, all over the world. And I would like to share some statistics around that. And as we can see on this chart, in all the 5 UN regions, actually the 6 UN regions, Oceania, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Africa, Northern America, Asia, and Europe, the number of international migrants has increased, particularly in Europe and Asia. In the past 20 years. And the same in the Canadian context. In 2021-2022, Canada's population has increased, and 93.5% of that increase was due to immigration. So what does this tell us about the international students population that we have in our classes? The implication is that the number of international students that we have in our classes has increased, and this is the number of study permit holders with a valid permit in Canada in the past 20 years. And as we can see, up until the pandemic, there is an increase, and then there is a sharp decrease around 2020 when the pandemic hit, and then we see an increase after that again in 2021. So in terms of the nationalities that many of these students come from, India is the first one, and this is the top 10. So recently, India is the #1 place, followed by China, France, Iran, Vietnam, Korea, the Philippines, the States, Nigeria, and Mexico. So these are the 10 countries from which international students come from, in the from the first to the 10th place. So the reason I share this statistic is to highlight the importance of the impact that this international migration has on higher education and also on work as an educator who teach in such contexts. When I was looking at the impact of migration on higher education, I noticed a gap in the literature. So, although past studies have explored international migration and education, few include instructors' reflexive investigation of the response to teaching multilingual and multicultural classes in the Canadian higher education system. And to bridge this gap, I decided to conduct this study from a transcultural, translingual perspective and also from a constructivist theory. This is the theory that has informed my teaching practice for the past 20 years, and I found it very meaningful to incorporate that when I was looking at this data and analyzing the data that I collected in my classes. So I want to begin by providing a very quick definition of the theoretical frameworks that I have used. Transculturalism involves situating oneself in living in social spaces and drawing from values and practices of diverse cultures to constantly reconstruct one's identity and social belonging. Transculturalism also emphasizes decoupling the link between community and culture and focuses on practices and processes rather than on product or form. Also, translingualism considers the languages in synergy, creating new meanings and forms in contact, and assumes communication occurs by mobile verbal resources that are appropriated beyond separate labels. So what this means is that if we have a transcultural, translingual perspective, we look at languages and cultures not as distinct entities. And there is no very clear, very fixed boundary among those languages and cultures that come together in a room. If we have this perspective, then we look at the classroom environment as a mixture of different cultures and languages that are represented, and we try to remove boundaries among these cultures and languages. Constructivism that has informed this study as well is an approach to teaching and learning based on the premise that learning is the result of mental construction. According to this view, students learn by fitting new information together with what they already know. Also, learning is affected by the context in which a lesson is taught and by the students' beliefs and attitudes. So, proponents of constructivism encourage students to use active techniques such as experiments and real-world problem solving to reflect on what they are learning and also to make a meaningful connection between what they are learning in class and what is happening outside class. So, in another word, constructivist theory tries to make a meaningful connection between old information and new information. So old information is people's background knowledge and experiences that they bring themselves to the learning situation, and new information is the lesson that they are learning. And teachers who have this as the theoretical framework for their teaching try to make a connection between what the students know and what the students are learning. Tam lists the following 4 basic characteristics of constructivist learning environment. The first one being knowledge will be shared between teachers and students. Teachers and students will share authority. The teacher's role is one of facilitator or guide, and learning groups will consist of small numbers of heterogeneous students. And what is very interesting in all of this is that we see a shift in the role of the teacher. So versus traditional approaches to teaching, in this approach, teacher is not the knower, is not the transmitter of information. Teacher is just a facilitator who helps students discover knowledge rather than transferring the correct information to the students. And students learn best by doing rather than by sitting down listening. So this study, the context of this study was an undergraduate academic writing course about around between 15 and 30 ESL and English-speaking students in art and design programs. The students came from Iran, China, Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil for the most part. And the course learning outcome was to improve the students' formal and research writing skills. The course materials that are used included a textbook titled Academic Writing for Graduate Students. I also created handouts, and I also shared my research papers as examples of scholarly writing with the students. And we also covered citation and academic integrity issues. I asked the students to do different learning activities, hands-on, task-based, group, and individual work. The materials that I collected included the teaching materials. I also reflected on the teaching techniques that I used to teach that course, and I took notes. And after each class, I took notes, descriptive and reflective field notes, and then I analyzed them to find the emerging themes. The data were collected during winter, spring, summer, and fall 2021. So what are the results? The first result was to blur the language boundaries among the languages that were represented in class, and also to have the students use their first languages that they speak in order to learn academic literacy. I encourage the students to take notes in their first language. and at the pre-writing and critical reading stage. So as I said before, this is an academic writing class, and the students took that course in order to learn to write a research paper in English. But the first thing I did in the first session was to teach them how to write formally and professionally in English. But before I give a lecture about how to write formally and professionally in English, I asked the students to tell me how they write formally and professionally in their first language. So this is to make a connection between the students' old information and background information before we move on to new information and learning about English formal writing conventions. I also encourage the students to share examples, as I said, of formal and informal words and grammatical structures in their first language, that is languages other than English, before they learn English formal writing conventions. The aim was to develop metalinguistic awareness of and rhetorical sensitivity to various languages, forming a new understanding of language usage and use that rise above the individual languages and communities, to acknowledge common grounds in the languages represented in class and blur the boundaries among them, to acknowledge the students' bilingual, multilingual competence, using it as an asset to gain new knowledge about academic writing, to share authority with the students and actively involve them in their learning process, and to utilize the students' pre-existing knowledge and to build on that. So as I explained earlier, all of these are impacted by the framework that I brought to my teaching, the transcultural, translingual framework, and also constructivist theory. This approach works against the monolingual instructional assumptions and ideologies that are unfortunately still existent in some educational contexts, in which students are strongly discouraged from using their first languages when they learn a second language. In order to blend language boundaries, the other thing I did, I used examples from my own first language. My first language is Farsi, and what I do, I give examples of formal and informal words from Farsi to break the ice, because it was actually interesting to know that when I asked the students to share examples from their first language, many of them were reluctant to do so. And at the beginning, I thought maybe they are shy, but then I thought it is a little bit more than shyness. They are not really used to using their first language when they are learning a second language, maybe because of past educational experiences where they were discouraged from using their first language. So if they are learning English, maybe, I don't know, this is just my assumption, that maybe they were asked not to use their first language because no connection had been seen between the first language and the second language. So students may honestly found it weird when I asked the students to share examples of their first language. But when I started doing that, then they were encouraged to provide examples, and we had really interesting discussions around formal and informal words and grammatical structures in various languages. So the aim was to make the students comfortable, as I said, to act as a facilitator. I wanted to be involved in the learning process rather than me teaching the students. I wanted to act as a student, being involved in the learning process and sharing examples of formal and informal language, formal and informal words in a language other than English that I speak. So to give you an example, these are the examples that I shared with the students, and this is a very basic, very easy greeting that we use in Farsi in 3 different ways. So if you want to greet someone in Farsi very formally for how are you, we can say حال شما چطوره, but this is conversational. If I want to write it in an email, I cannot say حال شما چطوره, I should say امیدوارم حالتان خوب باشد, which is similar to I hope this finds you well. If I want to make it less formal, I can say چطوری, which is like how are you doing, and if I want to make it completely informal, I can say چطوری, which is kind of similar to WhatsApp. So as we can see, there are 3 different forms of saying the same thing in terms of based on the context, based on the audience, and based on the purpose of communication. And this exists in all languages, that we have different ways of saying the same thing in all languages. And after I share this example, I ask the students to share similar examples from their first languages. And then we discuss the lexical, structural, functional, and modal characteristics of Farsi and English examples and those from the students' first languages. So in terms of lexical, then we discussed that different lexical items exist to express the same thing. In terms of structure, if you want to go formal, we use direct questions. If we want to go informal, we use direct questions. If we want to go formal, we use the segments. And there are different functions, and there are different modes of communication. So students learn to use language based on the context, audience, and purpose of communication. The other thing I do to teach that academic writing course was I asked the students to give each other feedback before they submit the final assignment to me. So what the students did, they wrote the first draft of their paper, and then I asked them to share the first draft with each other and give each other feedback. And the reason I did so was to promote group work and pair work in class, to promote task-based learning, and to promote translingual negotiation among the students. And I'm going to explain that further. When I asked the students to exchange their work with each other, I gave them the criteria that I would use to mark their paper, and this is the criteria. So that assignment was out of 30, and this is the breakdown of the grade. The order of the pieces and paper format, abstract, introduction, literature review, conclusion and recommendation, acknowledgement, bio, references, grammar, and mechanics of writing. Grammar, writing style, punctuation, and vocabulary. These are the items that were important for me to see in the paper. And I asked the students to use the same criteria to comment on each other's work. And I taught them how to give each other professional feedback. I said avoid fixing mistakes because some students were nice, they just fix the mistakes. But I said you don't fix the mistake, you just highlight the mistakes. You don't want to do the work for your peer, you just help them improve their work. So I said please don't fix the mistake in your partner's draft, just point them out and provide professional rather than emotional feedback. And that is very important because if they just say, oh my goodness, this is an excellent work, I mean, this is emotional feedback. This doesn't really help the student know what exactly was strong about their work. So I always encourage them to give each other logical, professional feedback and explain the strengths and weaknesses of the work using the evaluation criteria and offer suggestions for improvement. The students are asked to treat unconventional use of English in the peer papers as site of negotiation, and that was really important for me to see, rather than considering it as core practices or errors. They are encouraged to use questions to create a space for dialogue, transcultural negotiation. For example, they are encouraged to ask what is the main idea of this paragraph when the main idea has not been written. So this was an excellent chance for them to negotiate meaning rather than correcting each other. Although language use is not neglected on the evaluation criteria, they excluded terms such as standard written English. I purposefully wanted to avoid that, and also grammatical error. I didn't want to use grammatical error when I gave feedback to students, and then I asked the students to give each other feedback because these terms imply a monolingual instructional ideology, prioritizing English over other languages that I wanted to avoid in my class. So to conclude, employing the strategies mentioned in this presentation informed by the translingual, transcultural, and constructivist perspectives on learning assist the instructor to remain open-minded to the possibility of co-constructing knowledge with the students. This also assists the students to develop metalinguistic awareness about communication styles in various languages, removes the instructor from the center of the teaching stage, motivates the students to learn from each other, acknowledges the students' multilingual and multicultural competence, and utilizes this competence to construct new knowledge. This research challenges the necessity of following an English-only policy in teaching academic writing to multilingual students. This research also implies that a transcultural, translingual space can indeed be possible to create in the larger English as a medium of instruction context. Given the increasing number of international migrants using transcultural and translingual teaching approaches in the multilingual educational context are highly recommended. And this is what I wanted to end the presentation with, because this is really the highlight of my presentation, that increase in international migration is a fact. This has affected our practice as teachers and educators, and we can use this to our advantage to help our students learn better, rather than expecting them to leave their background information and their background knowledge behind the door and come to our class starting from zero. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, Nafne. So we have time definitely for questions and comments.
Yes.
Thank you so much.